Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for the final part of our story tonight. And what a fabulous story it is too, because we know that Aunt Louise is in hospital. She's in a coma, and so much chaos has been caused as a result of her dreadful injury. So let's see what's going to happen next. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 4 of our story tonight. I climbed down the tree with my sister Gretchen following behind me. We quickly chased after Pipkin, calling his name, but he refused to pay us any heed. And then we saw the object of his undivided attention. Lo and behold, we discovered that Pipkin had picked up the scent of the big hairy man that had rescued Aunt Louise from the woods on that bitter cold day in winter, with blustering winds and heavy snow, when a blast of wind had thrown her into a tree, so that Aunt Louise had lost consciousness after a head injury she had attained. The kind hairy man had brought her back to the cabin for safety. It was rather strange to run into him again like this, and it was in this quintessential moment I fully appreciated just how huge he actually was. Let's just say, standing next to him, I realized how by contrast me and my sister Gretchen were like fragile porcelain dolls that could so easily break. I had never felt this way about myself before. This hairy man was genetically hardwired to be as robust as a Californian redwood tree. He seemed as surprised to see us as we were indeed to see him, as if he'd been caught off guard, so to speak. But let's say Pipkin recognized the hairy man at once, as there was no doubt he was so thrilled to see him. He was jumping up and down ebulliently on the Herculean-sized man, pawing him to demand his attention. "I'm so sorry about Pipkin," I apologized, my face reddening with embarrassment, as Pipkin was demanding attention, and I didn't like the way he was behaving. "I guess he remembers you from when he saw you last. I think he really likes you." "Get down, Pipkin," I ordered. "Get down! Don't be so rude." But Pipkin, normally inclined to be obedient, simply refused to listen to me. The hairy man did not speak for a moment, but there was a humorous twinkle in his eyes. He bent down to squat on his powerful thighs, and affectionately took Pipkin into his overlong arms, and he began to pat Pipkin, and Pipkin was lapping it up like a cat with a bowl of milk. He was soon rolling on his back, straddling his blond legs in the air and demanding a tummy scratch, and the hairy man instinctively scratched Pipkin's stomach, as if he could tune in to what Pipkin wanted, and not everybody knew that Pipkin loved having his stomach scratched. The hairy man suddenly got up and broke off a sizable twig from a branch and threw it for Pipkin to catch, chuckling as he did so. Pipkin began to woof in delight and charge off after the stick, bringing it back to the hairy man's feet and dropping it on the ground, sitting back on his haunches while he waited for the hairy man to throw the stick for him again. I'd never seen anyone throw a stick so far. In an eager haste, I tried to copy the hairy man by throwing a stick for Pipkin myself, for the dog to catch. But I regret that my cumbersome efforts were stunted, and the stick didn't go terribly far. The hairy man showed me how it was done. He corrected my posture and positioned my arms in such a way to improve my swing. But even though my throwing improved exponentially, it was still a long way off from being as impressive as the hairy man's. I couldn't help but like the hairy man instinctively, as did my sister Gretchen. We were both incredibly comfortable in his company. I had guessed he was a wild man of sorts, that probably lived in the woods and hunted his own food. You get that kind of unorthodox maverick man, living out here in Alaska, who enjoys fending for himself and living off-grid. I assumed this wild hairy man was like one of them, but his size and the hair that covered his entire body was, I have to admit, a tad unusual. Consequently, under the bright light of the morning sun, his hair, I realized, wasn't black, but a dark brown shade. His arms were so long and his shoulders impressively big. Later I was to learn that the hairy man was known by many as a Bigfoot. "Do you live around here?" I asked him curiously. The hairy man spoke to me in his native tongue, but I naturally seemed to understand what he was saying. Kantolo baki ha masa, hilati kaswani, ha kilasono paka. I don't live in any Pacific location, but I do have my favourite haunts, and this part of the world is one of them, so I keep coming back here as often as I can. I like this place very much, because if you must know, this is where I was born. He then pointed towards the woodgrove and singled out the tree covered in bright pink blossoms. You see that tree over there? I was born under it. Over there, he said. My mother wasn't expecting me to arrive quite so quickly, so I took everyone by surprise when I popped out, so to speak. You were born under that pretty tree over there? I asked, looking both bewildered and impressed, as being born under such a magnificent tree was so much better than being born in a mediocre hospital bed like I was. I was, he said proudly, and I'm glad to say it was in blossom like it is now. My mother said I arrived in the world like a windstorm, that she never saw coming. There were no warning signs for her. Just a very slight cramp in the stomach and a few twinges. And that was followed by a sudden urgency to push me out. And then there I was. I just slid out of her body, and then I began to cry. I was born with effortless ease, and my mother had no pain apart from the little cramp. It was under a full moon that I was born, which our kind consider very special. When I fortuitously arrived on the scene earlier than anyone anticipated, the first word my mother uttered, that came out of her mouth, that is, was Umbenga. So that is what my parents decided to call me. I think it's a very appropriate name in the circumstances, do you not think? Hampan takilakwa Umbenga, talikasana kwanilo. Umbenga, I said. What on earth does that even mean? I've never heard of that name before, but I do kind of like it. It means the one that comes out fast without any delay. So that's my name. So you're Umbenga, I said, repeating it. I do like it. Well, I live up to my name, he assured me. I have a reputation for being in the right place at the right time. Everything I do is instinctive, and it's always fast and efficient. He paused for a brief moment and looked at me with questioning eyes. Kalitola pansikwa. Is the lady still sleeping? He asked me. Sorry, I said. What are you talking about? He means, interjected my sister, who was always as sharp as a tack. He's asking you if Aunt Louise is still sleeping. I'm afraid so, I said uneasily. She hasn't woken up yet. She may never wake up, so my mum's very sad about it all. It's horrible being indoors with her because my mother is miserable all the time and very mean to us. And she gets so snappy. She's been a bit better recently because she's drinking alcohol, and my father believes she's stopped, but we know differently, don't we, Gretchen? My sister nodded. Mum is really horrible these days. I so wish Aunt Louise would stop sleeping, and then we could be happy again. That's why we're playing out of doors. My mummy kicked us out of the cabin because she wants to drink in secret without us seeing her. She started to drink because she's really upset all the time about Aunt Louise. She's angry because Aunt Louise is very lazy and refuses to wake up. She's been sleeping for so very long. Kolo paki santwa, hakila sana tolono, magilani kolo manasu, shansikwa. Your mother is upset about the sleeping lady that I brought to your cabin? The hairy man asked. Why would she be upset? She needs to exercise a little more patience. When the winter comes and it gets very cold out here, I know that in the months that lie ahead, the summer will be around the very next corner. And when summer comes, everything bursts into blossom all over again. New life begins. All the animals and plants know all this, due to their instinctive programming. With everything there is a season. You can't hurry it forward prematurely.
Look at the flowers of the field. They've been programmed to flower in spring and summer. If they flowered in the winter months, they would surely die, be suffocated to death by the snow. With everything, it has its perfect timing. Even the bears know when it's time to go into hibernation. Everything wakes up at the right time, and so will your aunt. But impatience will only sever your mother's hope.
But you don't understand, I explained. My mother doesn't think Aunt Louise will ever wake up. She thinks Aunt Louise... I did not want to complete the sentence, as my sister Gretchen was looking directly at me through her big blue inquiring eyes that didn't miss a beat. At 8 years old, I don't think she had any real comprehension about how serious Aunt Louise's condition really was. Because in her whimsical mindset, Aunt Louise was obstinately refusing to wake up because she was bone idle and incredibly lazy and didn't want to get out of bed. So I couldn't say the words to the big man, because I felt as if I might be tempting fate. I knew it would also upset Gretchen if I should talk about Aunt Louise's condition with such a downcast projection, but at the same time, I really wanted the hairy man to know that my Aunt Louise might never wake up. The hairy man shook his head. I think he knew what I was implying. He seemed to read my mind like an open book. I noticed his soulful, dark, treacle-coloured eyes were sharp and discerning. I've never known anyone to read my thoughts quite like that, which in itself is scary, because I wouldn't want someone to know what I was thinking all the time, as this hairy man so obviously did.
I told you, when I saw you last, it wasn't her time, the hairy man assured me. Hankila na tolompanki. I can see in you a great deal of worry, a great deal of distress, many sleepless nights. You spend so much of your time concerning yourself with things that may never happen. You create in your mind a chaotic tangle of thoughts, and when you think like this, it is not good for your health. It is no way for you to conduct your life.
Whose time isn't it yet? Asked my sister. What are you talking about? She said, looking from me to the hairy man for an answer or simple explanation.
Cantola paki sanaqua, hom fali nalino kolo sansi, hashaka sanaqua. What I'm saying, little girl, said the hairy man, is that your aunt is in hibernation mode, rather like a bear when it retreats for the winter months. The body is hardwired sometimes to shut itself down for a while it begins to heal itself, so that it stays in a long sweet sleep, and repairs are made. Sometimes that body flatlines, deciding it can't take on the challenge, and the person will evacuate their body. But that is never going to happen in your aunt's case, because, as I was saying, it is not her time. And your aunt has never agreed to leave early. She has still got life left to live, and so she is not going anywhere.
But how can you be sure of this? I asked. You don't even know my Aunt Louise. Well, not really. I know you helped her that time, but you don't know her in person.
Foko no tola, sanquina. I told you there's a time for everything, young man, and it is not your aunt's time to go. When she was pushed over by the wind into the tree and fell backwards, I could see all the green shoots in her energy signature, like you might see in the abundance of shoots in the ground, even if those shoots are trampled on and some damage is done. What do? They repair themselves, and before you know it, life once again bursts through the ground, stronger than it was before. The same thing will happen for your aunt. She will wake up soon. I can assure you of that. I wouldn't say such things if it were not true. Now I better be going. I have some travelling to be done. I'm meeting up with my mother for the hunt.
When the hairy man told us that Aunt Louise would ultimately wake up, I wholeheartedly believed his every word, as did my sister Gretchen. We did not doubt him for a second. I knew the sagacious, wise hairy man seemed to have an innate, almost supernatural ability and understanding of things that I knew nothing about. I could feel an excitement fluttering around in my heart, and me and my sister were so incredibly animated, we hurried back to the cabin to tell my mother the great news. She didn't have to worry about Aunt Louise's condition anymore, because Aunt Louise would be getting better. She'd wake up when the time was right, and she was not going to die. I could visualize my mother ebulliently dancing around with us on the kitchen floor, looking radiantly happy about the great news we had to convey to her. We burst through the front door of the cabin and hurriedly ran into the kitchen. My mother was seated at the table, with an empty glass of wine in her hands. Her fingers were physically trembling. How much wine had she drunk, I wondered. Her skin was flushed, her cheeks rosy, and the end of her nose decidedly pink. It always went like that after she'd drunk too much.
"What are you staring at, Donovan?"
my mother said.
"Never seen a glass of wine before? Why are you back so early? You're supposed to be out there playing, aren't you? I gave you all this free time. What are you doing back here?"
"Mum, you shouldn't drink. You promised Dad you wouldn't touch the stuff anymore. It's very bad for you. If Dad knew, he'd be very upset with you," I told my mother. "The wine in the cellar is only for special occasions."
"Your father must know nothing about this. Do you understand, Donovan?"
I nodded half-heartedly, that is, wondering if I could possibly keep the secret from my father. He deserved to know what my mother was doing to herself. It wasn't right.
"What are you staring at, Gretchen?"
my mother asked, sensing that both me and my sister were studying her curiously, like an exhibit at the museum. "Mummy, we saw the big hairy man again, the one that rescued Aunt Louise," Gretchen spouted out excitedly.
"What are you talking about, Gretchen?" my mother asked. "What hairy man?"
"The one that found Aunt Louise in the woods and brought her back to the cabin."
"What about him, Gretchen?" my mother asked.
"Well, he told us that Aunt Louise will definitely wake up," I interjected on my sister's behalf. "Mum, Aunt Louise is not going to die. She's coming home soon. She's just sleeping. The hairy man said her body is focusing on healing, that's all. When she's better, she'll wake up. He says she's definitely going to wake up. He saw it in her energy signature. We all carry an energy signature you see on the outside of our body. Most people can't physically see it, but you can tell things about that person if you can read the energy signature. And Aunt Louise has a green energy signature. Green means life. She's still got a whole lot of living to do. He says it's not her time to go, that she's still got life to live." My mother looked at me, with rage creeping into her eyes.
"I don't know who this hairy man is, but you can go and tell him to suck eggs, will you? Who the hell does he think he is, telling you Aunt Louise is going to wake up? He knows nothing about her condition, nothing at all. Is he trying to pretend he's psychic or something? I don't buy into all that stuff and nonsense, and neither should you. You should know better than that."
"Mum, he knows things. He's very clever," I told her.
"Only God knows things like that, Donovan," said my mother, glaring at me. "Now stop your stuff and nonsense, will you, and get the hell out of this kitchen. I need some time to myself. If you don't want to play out of doors, that's well and good. But then you can go to the lounge and continue with your work."
In that moment my heart sank. I could see it would take more than a miracle to lift my mother out of her melancholic, grimy ditch in which she found herself so sadly entrenched. She simply refused to believe that Aunt Louise was going to get any better any time soon. She had clearly decided to turn to drink in order to cope with her grief. I knew if my father, who was in his study tapping away at his computer, were to see my mother right now, drowning her sorrows in one of those expensive bottles of wine, he'd be less than pleased about this. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm sad to say that my mother began to drink a hell of a lot, but she managed to function normally and kept the house in good condition, while successfully hiding the fact that she was drinking behind my father's back, who for some reason seemed blindly oblivious of what she was doing under his nose. I sometimes wondered if my father was deliberately turning a blind eye to my mother's drinking problem, as it was easier to be blissfully ignorant than to admit the truth. Me and Gretchen knew that slowly but surely the expensive collection of prized wines my parents had proudly collected over the years were beginning to get drunk in stealth by my mother. I would watch my mother cunningly fill the wine bottles with water and replace them back into the cellar, so it looked as if nothing had been drunk. She did this so expertly, it was easy to be fooled. So dare I say this, she was masterfully pulling the wool over my father's eyes. I really wanted to tell my father what was going on, but he seemed happy that my mother was making more of an effort these days. She was supervising our homework, cooking for us, and even running a duster around the house from time to time, so the cabin looked warm and inviting again. I knew it was the alcohol that was helping her function better, but even at 10 years old, I fully appreciated that this was no way for my mother to be dealing with her stress. Before long, things would spiral out of control. I was sure of that, and my mother might turn into a raging alcoholic. It was then that I promptly decided I absolutely had to tell my father what was going on. He needed to know that behind his back my mother was drinking like a fish. I knew this revelation would upset him greatly, but he had to know the truth. I couldn't keep the secret from him any longer. One morning I was knocking rather tentatively on my father's study door. I wasn't happy about what I was going to convey to him, because I knew I was being a snitch. "Come in," my father called. I reluctantly entered the study, but my father gave me a warm, encouraging smile and looked up at me from the computer. "Everything all right, Donovan?" he asked, raising one of his bushy dark brows. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" "It's Mum," I said rather gingerly. "What about your mother?" he asked me. "She's so much better these days, is she not? She's been making a marvellous effort around the house. I know it's been tough for her, with Aunt Louise being in coma. Well, in a coma. But I'm proud of the remarkable efforts she's making at long last. At least she's not locking herself up in the bedroom all day. That's a huge turnaround as far as I'm concerned." "Dad, you don't know the truth. You don't see what I see, because you're working all the time. But a lot has been going on behind your back that you know nothing about, and it's not good, I'm afraid." "What is that I'm failing to see, son? Go on, enlighten me, will you?" Mum is drinking, Dad. She's always drinking. She hides it from you. She washes the smell of the alcohol away with mouthwash, and she sucks peppermints all the time, so you can't tell what she's doing. I don't mean to snitch on her, Dad, I really don't, but I'm so worried about her. I know she doesn't act drunk, but she is drunk most of the time. She hides it well, that's all." My father let out a chuckle. "I think I would know if your mum was drinking, son." "I see her drinking, Dad, all the time. So does Gretchen. You can ask her if you don't believe me. She sees Mum drinking too." "Son, where are you getting this idea from? Your mother hasn't been into Anchorage for ages. Where on earth would she acquire this alcohol you speak of from? I may remind you, she'd have to buy it first. And I know for a fact that she hasn't touched the stuff in the cellar. I've been keeping tabs on all those bottles, to be sure." "Dad, she's been drinking all the wine from the cellar. That's where she's getting it from. It's your prize collection that she's drinking."
"That is not possible, son. The bottles of wine in the cellar have not been drunk. I would know if our stock had been diminished in any way. Besides, I trust your mother. She gave me her solemn promise she wouldn't ever drink again, after I caught her last time, and threw the wine in the sink, if you remember. I made her swear to me that she'd never touch a drop of alcohol again, and she promised me she would not."
"Dad, she's lying to you."
My father frowned. "What makes you so sure, Donovan, that she's drinking wine in the cellar? The last time I looked, all the bottles were there, and that was only the other day."
"Because I saw her, Dad. I'm always seeing her. She's very conniving. She fills the wine bottles in the cellar with water. She then makes them look like they're brand new, as if they haven't been opened. But she's got through so much of that wine. She's probably drunk most of your collection already. When she asks you to go to Anchorage, that is probably when she'll be buying more boxes behind your back, I bet." My father's face drained of its colour.
"Why did you not tell me this before, Donovan?"
"I don't know. I guess I was just scared, Dad."
"Scared of what, son?"
"Mummy getting angry with me and you getting upset when you realise Mummy's not getting better after all."
"Son, you did the right thing telling me this," said my father. Leave this to me, will you?"
My father rose from his chair and abruptly walked past me. I followed him like a bashful lapdog as he made his way to the cellar, and he began to look through all the bottles of wine. He inspected the bottles closely, and I heard him whistle and say,
"I'll be damned. You're right, son. Many of these bottles have been tampered with, and they looked like they contained coloured water, and have been put back so ingeniously by your mother. It's almost impossible to tell they've been drunk at all. I'm almost impressed by her treachery."
Let's just say my dad was less than amused by this. I followed him as he went storming into the kitchen, his whole body shaking like a rattle with indignation. It was the angriest I'd ever seen him before, and for a moment I began to deeply regret having told him what my mother had been getting up to behind his back. My mother was in the kitchen at the range, stirring something in a very large pot that smelt extremely good. I believe she was making a bolognese sauce to serve with pasta. I could smell the delicious scent of herbs and garlic. I had seen her sneak a drink this morning, so it was lucky that she could hold her alcohol extremely well, which I suspect was one of the reasons my father probably chose to believe that she had not been drinking behind his back. But alcoholics, I understand, can be masterfully cunning in hiding the extent to which they actually drink.
"What is this?"
my father asked my mother, presenting her with a bottle of wine that was filled with the coloured water. My father ripped away the cork and the covering, and he emptied the water from the wine bottle into the sink and said,
"This is not wine, is it, love? This is coloured water, is it not? I think you've got some explaining to do, Angela."
My mother's face paled. It turned a shade of pink.
"What are you talking about? It's a bottle of wine, Ivan," she said. "It was a bottle of wine, you mean. But the bottle has been very cleverly filled with coloured water that looks as if it's wine. You drank the wine in this bottle, didn't you, Angela? I'm not a fool. I can see what's going on here. And to say that I am furious is an understatement."
"I can't think what you're talking about, Ivan. You're not making any sense at all. Why would you throw perfectly good wine like that out in the sink?"
"That was coloured water, and you know it. And you know it because you put that water in the bottle. You had me fooled, love. You have got through hundreds of bottles behind my back, have you not? We've been collecting those wines for years, and you've been drinking them all. I'm going to lock that cellar up right now, so you can't get your hands on any more alcohol. I've had enough of your duplicity, Angela. You cannot be drinking while looking after our children. You have a responsibility, Angela, to take care of our kids. And all you selfishly think about is yourself all the time. You are self-centered, Angela. You disgust me. Don't you even care about your own children? Do you think they want a drunk for a mother? You seriously need help, Angela. You really do. And whether you like it or not, first thing tomorrow morning, I'm taking you to Anchorage to see Dr. Thornby. You cannot go on like this. You're barely functioning. I've had enough. And I'm not putting up with this a second longer. Do you understand?
"I won't go to see Dr. Thornby. You can't make me," my mother cried out indignantly. "Besides, there's nothing wrong with me at all. I'm perfectly fine."
"Nothing wrong with you, Angela? I beg to differ,"
my father said, his eyes widening in disbelief.
"Are you kidding me? Look at you. You're an absolute mess. How much wine are you actually getting through in that cellar? You've drunk so much, I'm terrified to count. It's not normal to rely on drink to function. And all this time you made me believe that things were improving around here. That finally, at long last, you'd got your act together. And the kids were getting their mother back. You were beginning to make things look good around the house. You were cooking again and looking after the kids' homework. The only thing propping you up all the time so that you were functioning normally was drink. Thank God Donovan told me what was going on with you, because you had me fooled, Angela. I can't believe I've been so blind-sighted. I should have guessed something was up with you."
My mother's face grew red, her eyes fixed on me with dagger looks. I was standing in the doorway trembling. I could sense my mother's unbridled rage that was boiling up inside her like a kettle on the hob.
"You!
she said, pointing a dagger of a finger at me. "How dare you, Donovan, go telling your father about this? How dare you snitch on me?"
"Don't you dare go blaming Donovan for this. He informed me what was going on because he loves you. He's extremely worried about you. To see his mother drinking to excess, he was reluctant to tell me what was going on, but I'm very glad he did. He's a responsible young man."
My mother growled at us. "I hate the both of you! Get away from me!" she shrieked belligerently, storming off to her bedroom and locking the door behind her. Somehow I had a sense that once Dad locked up the cellar and Mum couldn't get to any of the wine to anaesthetize her emotional discord, that things would get progressively worse from now on.
"Well, that went well, didn't it?" said my father. "First thing in the morning I'm taking your mother to Anchorage to see Dr. Thornby. I should have done that a long time ago. We need to fix this problem."
Later that afternoon, my mother was pretending to be nice to me. She asked me if I wanted to come with her for a casual stroll to the woods, and I immediately smelt a rat. My mother never went for walks in the woods. I knew my mother was up to something. I could see a tight look on her face, that she was hiding something, and I knew what this was about. It was easy to guess. I suspected when we were out of the woods away from my father's sight, my mother would lightly blow a tangent at me. She knew I was the one that had snitched on her about the alcohol. I guess she wanted to express her extreme indignation without my father around to rein her in. She was mad at me. Let's just say a drunk that is deprived of alcohol is not going to take it very well. Since Aunt Louise's accident, my mother had shown no interest in going for a walk, but I reluctantly agreed to go with her, as I had been raised to do her bidding, and refusing her was not something I'd be inclined to do. "Can Gretchen come with us?" I asked, already knowing what the answer would be.
"No, she can't. I think it would be nice to go for a walk with you," said my mother, giving me a watery, insincere smile. "Let's spend some quality time together, shall we, Donovan?" she said in a saccharine, sweet voice. "I haven't been for a walk with you in ages, and what a beautiful day it is."
I felt rather nervous as I walked with my mother down the footpath with Pipkin charging ahead of us into the woods. I wish I could say I was happy about this walk. It really was beautiful in the woods. On any other occasion, I would certainly have been glad of the fresh air and exercise. But right now I was walking on eggshells, waiting for my mother to erupt into a fireball of anger. Finally my mother stopped in her tracks, turned around, and looked straight at me, with dark, furious eyes. "How dare you, Donovan? How dare you tell your father that I was drinking? I needed that wine to function. Don't you understand? How could you do this to me? I'm your mother, for goodness sake." In that moment my mother just burst into tears. She then just sat down on the ground, sobbing. She was inconsolable with grief, and truly I felt like a prize cad for snitching on her in the way that I had. "I was drinking, Donovan, because it helps me get through the day. Don't you understand that?" "Ma'am, I'm really sorry. I told Dad about it because you need help. You know you do. You shouldn't be drinking so much. It's not healthy."
"What did you say?"
said my mother, wiping the tears from her red puffy eyes. For a second she looked so enraged, like a rabid dog that was about to launch a furious attack on me. And the next thing I knew was she was shaking me hard. Pipkin was barking at my mother, and barking loudly, and my mother was screaming at me and slapping me with her hands.
"How could you do this to me? How could you do this to me, Donovan?"
"I'm so sorry, Mum," I cried out. "I had to tell Dad. I was worried about you."
"No, you weren't worried about me, Donovan. You were thinking of yourself as usual. You're always thinking of yourself. Why did I raise such a selfish young man?"
My mother continued to shake me hard. I was amazed by her strength, and she was beginning to hurt me, and I was crying out, "Mum, please stop! Please stop!" Pipkin continued to bark furiously. The next thing I knew, the hairy man had pulled my mother off me. He appeared from nowhere, and when my mother saw him, she stood there shaking like a leaf, and everything went incredibly calm. She stared up into the hairy man's eyes, and I'm telling you this with certainty. I know he was hypnotizing her. I absolutely know it with every fibre of my being, because when he'd finished holding her gaze, I heard his voice in my own head telling me all would be well now, and I was to go home. I am not kidding when I say this to you, but my mother completely forgot about her grievances over the alcohol. She left the woods with a skip in her step, telling me how she couldn't wait for Aunt Louise to get better, and how Aunt Louise would be home very soon. My mother's personality, after her interaction with the Bigfoot, changed so dramatically. I didn't know what to make of it. The strangest conundrum of all is when I asked her what she thought of the hairy man that we'd encountered in the woods, she looked at me as if I was stark raving mad and said, "What hairy man are you talking about, Donovan? There was no hairy man." That was when I realized that the hairy man had made my mother no longer remember him. He had incredible abilities, that was for sure. When my mother returned to the cabin, she began industriously fixing everything up in the cabin. She was back to her old self again, singing to herself all day long. She'd visit Aunt Louise in hospital, and when the doctors gave her a grim report on Aunt Louise, she would roll her eyes, throw her arms up dismissively in the air, and tell the doctors that Aunt Louise would wake up, and they didn't know what they were talking about. "Ma'am," they would say, "I'm afraid to say it's not looking good for your sister." My mother would answer, "Just you wait and see. She's going to wake up any time soon." Ostensibly, my father could not comprehend the dramatic metamorphosis in my mother's character. In a whisper of a breath, he'd got his wife back, and me and my sister were once again reacquainted with the mother we loved so much. My father never even took my mother to Anchorage to see Dr. Thornby, as she expressed no interest in drowning her sorrows in alcohol any more. Instead, she industriously began to refurbish Aunt Louise's bedroom, painting it in bright yellow. She went off to Anchorage to buy all kinds of bits and bobs for Aunt Louise, including beautiful comforters, pillows, cushions, bed linens, and covers. She turned my aunt's bedroom into a work of art that would have looked right at home in a glossy magazine. "We need the bedroom to be absolutely perfect for your Aunt Louise when she comes back home," she said. And I knew by the way she was speaking, with such a pronounced conviction, that she was not even nursing a shadow of doubt that Aunt Louise would be coming home. My father looked extremely troubled by this. He was wondering if my mother's positive changes were because she was now in complete denial about Aunt Louise's precarious condition. "Love," he told her kindly, "I'm extremely proud of your progress. You've made me very impressed that you're not drinking, and you're taking such good care of the kids, the house, and me. You've made your sister Louise's room look beautiful. I'm just a bit worried you're getting your hopes up about your sister. You do realize she might not wake up." What my mother said next to my father is exactly what the hairy man had told me and my sister Gretchen. "Ivan," she said, "everything has a season. The flowers do not burst through the earth until it's summer and spring, for they know they wouldn't survive the winter months. So they switch off, do they not? But when the time is right, they wake up, and once again they grace the meadows with their cheerful colours. Louise will do the same. She'll wake up soon when she's good and ready." I know this is impossible to believe, but 7 days after this, my Aunt Louise woke up from her coma, and within a week she'd returned home, as if nothing had ever happened, and everything returned to normal again, almost as if the grief we'd been through as a family was just a passing nightmare that had never really happened. Needless to say, Aunt Louise never even remembered anything about her unfortunate accident, and Pipkin was so happy to be reunited with his very best friend, greeting her as if she'd returned home from a long trip abroad. I marvelled how accurate the hairy man had been about everything, and I'm glad to say I did see him a handful of times after that. But these days, as a married man that now lives in Juneau with my family, I think over those memories of my childhood with so much fondness. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.